Today I'm going to talk about work that I've been leading with the team at BGC, and it grows on, again, a lot of the work that I've been working on over the last 20 years around Edmonton. Down and go up. First of all, just to give you a bit of an idea, like I've seen people here that I've known for over 20 years that haven't seen me in a decade and wonder where I went. I'm a 94 grad of geological engineering at the University of British Columbia. Around that time, my supervisor was an ex-U of A grad and said, you'll probably go to a master's at U of A. So in 96, I moved to Edmonton to work with Dave Cruden, look at landslides, and I never left. So I've been in Edmonton for 27, I guess going on 28 years, and I've again found a home here and raised my children and have enjoyed my time. Some of you, I worked with Paul Locke and others, and Kerry Murray and others at HBT, Agra, and AMEC between 94 and 05, and then took an offer from a client in 05 to lead a big geohazard management instrumentation and early warning system on Turtle Mountain in southern Alberta, and to build a hazard program for the province of Alberta, and moved into management. And then moved more into a technical engineering role with the Alberta Energy Regulator. And in 2018, I had the opportunity to step back from government, decided what I wanted to do with my life. And during that time, I started my company, Wavelength, and started working for the Canadian Space Agency and the Norwegian government. And my very good friends, some of my classmates were the first employees at BGC. It was formed by my professors in 1990, and it was always home. So I was invited to come and join, and I've been working with BGC 2019, started as a consultant, 2020 to 2022 as on staff. And just as I move into my last few years of my career, decided that I want to keep working with them, but as my own company. So you're going to see work today. My entire presentation is going to be on a BGC template because it's BGC work with a team of people that I enjoy working with BGC, but I'm not actually I don't actually employed by BGC anymore. So just to clear the discussion. So today I'm going to talk about some work that's really been advancing over the last 3 years. In 2020, late 2020, a lot of clients in the pipeline sector started getting asked by the regulator in the States on the pipeline side to give them a precipitation value to which for any type of landslide, they would go out and respond. And they had to go out in the field and respond to and look at a landslide. And we had colleagues on the hydrotechnical side that said, well, we want to give a 25-year return period of a 24-hour rain event. We think that's a great number. And for us that work in soil mechanics and geology, we said, what's that based on? There's no basis. So what we started doing is saying, listen, there's a lot of really good work on landslide early warning, predictive analytics for landslides internationally. Let's look at that work. Let's look at the suite of landslides we have in this part of the world. Let's see where we can move. So we're going to talk about regional landslide early warning. We're going to talk about what are the components for operational early warning. We're going to talk about the suite of landslides in this region that we're sitting in right now. And we're going to start looking at how we're utilizing newer technology. I say new, there's technologies I've been working with for 20 years that I talk to every week that people that have never used. So again, newer technologies, and also getting into big data and data sets that are now actually accessible, that we don't, moving from a desktop-based world where we're actually linking into data that we don't have to manage, but we can analyze. I want to talk about some of the things we're learning and also give you a picture of kind of where I think we're moving over the next few years, because we are at a real inflection point with our ability to characterize landslide hazards across large regions internationally. So what I'm talking about here is regional landslide activity. We're going to call it early warning for this slide. Many of you you put in a slope inclinometer, you put in a strain gauge, you put in an SAA on a slope. You say, if I get over this much displacement, I need to take action. So you're used to working with displacement-based criteria. When you're looking at regional landslides, you aren't going to get that precise at any one location. There's no way you can characterize the complexity of the geology and what's happening at the slope level or at the regional level for that thing. So really, we're looking at what are the contributing factors that drive changes in landslide activity, and how can we characterize those, link those with past performance, and say, okay, based on past performance, if this happens again, we would expect an acceleration. And again, I'm talking about a suite of slopes that move episodically. We have roads that cross them. We have towns in Alberta built on them, and they move. And as long as they move in a predictable manner, we're fine. It's when they accelerate that we have issues. And so this is what we're trying to understand. When these landslides accelerate, but also, and this is the operational side of early warning. We want to be able to provide meaningful and actionable understanding so that the decision maker can make a decision. That's important because I work a lot with the International Landoware, the International Landslide Early Warning Community of Practice, and there's 90% of the people involved are from academia, and they have all these great models and whatever. And then you say, okay, like, what's your confidence for giving an owner of an asset a threshold that they can make a decision? And they don't, because if you cry wolf too many times, they won't listen. And if you miss it. So again, this is what we're talking about, is trying to provide actionable and meaningful awareness for when landslides might accelerate. And there's groups trying this internationally. This is the NASA model, their landslide hazard assessment situational awareness, LASA, which is built really based on steep slopes, rapid slope processes in residual soils and in tropical areas where they think they have a model that pulls in global precipitation models and landslide models. We've tried it in the inland areas, and it's not applicable, but maybe in steep slopes. The Norwegians have some models. They won't show on the screen, no worries. So I'll quit pointing it. The Norwegians are building forecasting models that are purely based on, again, a green, yellow, orange, red, say, based on this sort of, precipitation coming in this region, we would expect things to start to change, and you better take notice. So there are groups that are trying to do this. And of course, there's a multitude, like, you hear about Hong Kong and areas where they have steep slopes, shallow slides that respond very predictably to precipitation. There's a lot of systems like that. But again, what we're trying to do in this part of the world is understand, how big deep-seated landslides are moving. So when we say early warning means different things to different people. So in the very short term, either, when is it, are the conditions coming up with forecasts over the next few days or months that something might happen? Or, did something just happen, and where did it happen? There's also some groups that we work with, and we work with like Vincent at Trans Mountain and others, where they don't necessarily want to know what's going to happen next week, but they want to know what the farmer's almanac. What's going to happen over the next year or two? What are the cycles? And are the areas where we would expect things to be more active than they have been in the past? We have some clients, though, they don't even want to know that. They want to know, because again, a lot of the push is on climate resilience. They want to know, how has landslide activity changed in the past in response to hydroclimatic inputs? What are those forecasts for the change of hydroclimatic inputs? And how is the distribution and frequency of landsliding activity change going to change in the future? And how should I make decisions over the next 5, 10, 20 years based on my lifespan of my assets to allow for that? So we're getting, depending on who we're working with, we're getting all of those different time frames in place when we're trying to look at early warning or situational awareness. So, it's not just as we said with the, setting a threshold on an SI and jumping when something happens. We're trying to understand, people have different horizons for what warning means and what they actually need to support their job. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is aspects of what are the key components of building that understanding. First of all, we need an understanding of the landslides. What are the types of landslides? What are their characteristics? How do they behave? We need to know then, with and again, we're predominantly looking at hydraulically driven landslides. So we're not looking at human activity, cutting toes, loading crests. We're looking at these slowly moving landslides that, based on the water balance change, they either slow down or speed up. So how do you actually then at scale, you're not going to have, 2 million piezometers on the ground at every slope. How do we actually characterize regional hydroclimatic trends to look back? And then, depending on the types of assets you have and the decisions you need to make over the different timeframes, like what is the response, right? So it's not these are the types of things we're working with a number of clients on right now. So just to get us seated, I know a lot of people have different backgrounds here. Some people more of a civil bent, some people geological bent, but there's various types of landslides. But what we're focused on here are landslides that typically have failed in the past. They've deposited debris or colluvium, and they just slowly move over time. And when we talk about landslides, we're talking about things that we would characterize as slowly moving. This is just a modified Cruden and Barnes classification. We've added a couple little nuances based on our experience. But again, these are slides that if they're moving just slowly over up to tens or hundreds or 100 millimeters a year, you might not see it on the ground, right? So it's not till they actually are really moving in the multiple hundreds of millimeters or to meters where sometimes you're actually seeing these things move. So these are the types of slides that we're looking at. And these types of slides are very widespread. Pretty much anywhere where you have a river valley incised into either glacial sediments or into weak sedimentary bedrock in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, you're going to have a landslide. This is a susceptibility model that was built. The middle piece of the model is the Alberta Geological Survey map 621, the susceptibility model. And then one of my colleagues who just retired, Pete Quinn, built susceptibility models for northeastern British Columbia and southeastern Saskatchewan. But as a tool, just understanding where you're actually intersecting the types of landslides I'm talking about, this is just an idea of the distribution. And pretty much if you're roading a pipeline, designing a road, or many communities, you're on these features and you live with them. But knowing where they are is the first step. So not only knowing where they are, but understanding how they're formed and what they're comprised of is always going to be another key step. We have landslides. So what we have on the far right is the bedrock geology map of Alberta. Alberta Geological Survey puts that together. They have the sediment thickness map of Alberta showing the depth, essentially the depth of glacial sediments above bedrock. And what you'll see is in some areas, bedrock's really shallow, and you can see the types of bedrock you're in. In some areas in Alberta, you have over 300 meters of glacial deposits deposited in these ancient valleys or paleo valleys. So when you're looking at landslides, it is really important to understand what the modern day river's cutting in. This is a cross section at the town of Peace River, whereas on the west side of the town, and the entire town's built on top of this and the highway, it's built on old paleo valley infill that's failed over time and is actually likely not very active. It's likely what you call dormant. Whereas when you move on to the other side of the valley, you're into slides that are actually seated in the underlying shales. So again, big deep seated landslides impacting on infrastructure, but seated in different materials. And then from an investigation and mitigation point of view, again, different nuances. The depth of incision into these features will also depend on what's in the subsurface, right? We know that, there's some, depending on where you are, if you're deeply incised, you could get a full succession of shale. You could get, initiation of failures in the upper portions of slopes. And if they're more active slopes, you'll just see that upper area moving and continuing being eroded away. Versus the more mature abandoned slopes, you'll see this full apron of colluvium develop over time. And again, how they act hydraulically and how you investigate and manage these, all of these things are things that you need to consider when looking at these slopes. So in order to, you need to, first of all, we want to understand what controls the landslides in the area. But the next thing we need to try to understand is how they move and how it's different across across the region. And I'm going to talk about this a lot today, is what are some of the new technologies, that we're using and the new data that's coming out. I say new technologies, this is just satellite InSAR, and I'll talk a bit about that. But, ideally, not only do we know what are the types of landslides we have, but the variability between them and which ones are moving more quickly than others, spatially, but also temporally, how are things moving? And that's ultimately what we're trying to figure out here. So following this request from clients in 2020, we realized that we needed to start to find some way to build enough of a statistically relevant data set that we could actually start pulling together trend data from landslides to actually start to get these inflections and these changes in velocity and correlate them. So we were fortunate, and mainly with pipeline clients in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. We had about 20 clients. About 10 of them contributed, and up to now we've got almost 575, almost 600 slope inclinometers, over 46 shaped cell arrays at 175 unique slopes in the basin. And what we're trying to utilize those for is to, again, see where we have time series data. We had Sorab, who was a PhD student that just finished up with Renato, that spent last summer with us, going into all the data, pulling it apart, making sure that we understood the quality, how the data was collected, what it represented. So that was the initial base, saying, okay, can we get enough point series data that, of course, is going to have a bias, but that spatially helps us understand the regional trends? So we're starting to see broad regions with pretty good coverage, but we realize that we're still blind to a lot of other regions. So the other types of data that we've really started to rely on are remote sense data. Again, if you want to understand how landslides perform, it's looking back. And if you haven't drilled, instrumented, and monitored for a long time, understanding that is near impossible. But we're fortunate that there have been satellites that have been in orbit since 1992, where we theoretically can go back up to 30 years and look at historical movements. There's a lot of nuances and differences, and I'll talk about this, and I say theoretically. We're doing work in Washington State right now where it's not theoretical. We can actually go back 30 years, and it's amazing, the data coverage. In Alberta, it's a little bit hit and miss. We have satellites that, when I started working with InSAR, it was ERS-1 and RadarSat-1 in 2003. Where it was, you were lucky if the satellite had collected data, because you either had to pay and collect the data. So if you wanted to look back, the data typically wasn't there. And it wasn't until 2015, 2014, when the Sentinel-1A and B got launched by the European Space Agency, that all of a sudden you had freely available 12-day consistent coverage of the entire globe, where you actually, again, theoretically could go back and start tracking deformations. I'll talk a bit about that. That's a C-band satellite, which definitely has issues with vegetation, but it's still usable. And it's really, there's also a series of L-band satellites, L-band data from the Japanese Space Agency, the ALOS-1 and 2, which are really, there are some regions in North America where they have systematically collected data. Like, again, the work we're doing in Washington State, we've got 2006 to 2011 and 2014 to present with full L-band coverages where we can map movements in vegetative terrains. But again, in the WCSB, there's this data set that it's out there, and we want to figure out how to harness it. I put in some slides on InSAR because, again, I realize I've been working with it pretty routinely for 20 years, but a lot of people have never touched it. So just an overview. Reminder, we have satellites that are moving from South Pole to North Pole. They're looking to the right. They look at a piece of the Earth one way, and as they come down and the Earth rotates, they look at the exact same piece of ground the other way. So what we call ascending and descending orbits. So not only do they look that way, but they also look down at the Earth at an angle. It's called an incidence angle. So there's a satellite sensor sending microwaves down to the Earth, similar to LiDAR, similar to radar we see in our cars, but it's known wavelength. So based on the time it takes to return from the satellite to the ground and back, we can actually quantify the distance. So over time, essentially creates this digital elevation model, so that if you're looking at the ground from the exact same angle, you can compare essentially these digital elevation models and quantify change. And advances in processing over the last 20 years have been amazing, where there's so much they can do with building large stacks of data, filtering out noise, and you're starting to get down to be able to track confidently millimeter level change over years, depending on the terrain. When you're looking at landslides, again, geometry matters. Again, so not only that left and right looking, that incidence angle, but then coupling that with your knowledge of how the landslide's moving. So you need to understand the kinematic model, how the landslide's moving to really apply this data and say, okay, like, what is this actually representing? Is it not moving, or are we just not getting data because of the geometry of the satellite, or vice versa? But these are things you need to think about when using the data. Not only does the geometry matter, but the resolution and wavelength matter. Shorter wavelength, a lot of this, and it hits trees and things on the way down, and you don't get a lot of returns hitting the ground. Longer wavelength, more of a straight shot, and you get a lot more ground returns. Also, there's different resolutions of the image at. So this is just a site. This is site C, Yukon, where in one area we have both C-band on the upper left, X-band on the top right, and L-band on the bottom right. They were utilized for different purposes, some for plant site on site C, but most of the L-band and C-band were used for slope reservoir monitoring. And of course, the L-band in the vegetated terrain has become our real go-to. But again, there's all these types of data out there, and it's a matter of understanding how to apply it. So this is what we've been doing. We actually, as BGC, went out 3 years ago or 2 years ago, I guess, and bought on spec 140,000 square kilometers of InSAR, because we had 20 clients working in this footprint. And we've been integrating this data into their assessments ever since then. So for 140,000 square kilometers, we've got data that in some cases, I keep forgetting this isn't working, where again, we all those colors, when you zoom in, you actually can see the pixel, and depending on the way the slope's moving, the way you're imaging, you can theoretically get every 2 weeks a time series point when snow-free conditions. When you have snow, you're not going to get any ground returns. But again, we're using this a lot across different sectors to really start to characterize the seasonality movement and the spatial understanding of movement. So one of the things we're doing then with this project is not only taking the slope inclinometers, but we're taking the data and creating all these other monitoring points around the region. We're also using a lot of LiDAR. Most of you are familiar with LiDAR, and of course, in the simplest form, that great thing is that we can strip off the trees and get really high resolution digital elevation models to really look at all the details for landslides, which is great. But the advances over the last few years in the ability to difference and not change between LiDAR data sets is really advanced significantly. Initially, people would just take a digital elevation model and overlap them and look at change. Well, there's algorithms now that you can track points in 3 dimensions and watch the movement of a point. And not only can you do that, but using GPU processing, you can actually take large regions of data and actually process and things that in at least a couple orders of magnitude of time shorter than it used to take us just on a computer. And this is a technology my colleague Matt Latto, and now it's very patented for BGC, and BGC provides to its clients. So just, so with that, there's just the things we're able to do now at scale, and as opposed to a site basis, it just, it blows me away. But understanding, taking that understanding of the geology, taking the understanding of the kinematics, and actually starting to quantify movement and change. And again, at regional scale is really opening up to us. And this is Site C in northeastern BC, where we've developed landslide inventories over the years, and now we're using both InSAR and LiDAR to start mapping activity and relative activity of landslides. The nice thing about these technologies, and people get confused about the R's, LiDAR and InSAR, is they're different technologies but complementary. LiDAR is a straight shot. Where was it time A? Where was it time B? And it moved this much. But you don't know when it moved and how it moved. And And really it's kind of movements over those time periods of about 15, 20 centimeters is what you're looking at, is you'll be able to detect. If it's under 15 to 20 centimeters, that's where you're starting, and you can see it with LiDAR, that's where you're starting to see the LiDAR data. And what we're doing a lot of these big slides is we're creating an inventory, we're identifying a landslide polygon, and then starting to pull together longer term trends using a combination of InSAR when it's snow free and the LCD data to start pulling together a longer term definite displacement profile for these landslides. So these technologies are really changing and allowing us to better not only characterize, but also as we have historical LiDAR coverage and historical InSAR coverages, be able to look back in time and start to build these time series that will inform our model. So most of us have seen a lot of this technology and maybe are using it. The big aha for me that really has blown me away the last few years are some of these big global hydroclimate data sets. So what we're trying to do here, remember, it's about water balance. So we're talking typically about deeper seated landslides where the rupture surface is meters in depth, in some cases tens of meters. And as more moisture, when the moisture that goes in exceeds what's coming out, you'd expect that essentially that wetting front to progress. And of course, as that drives deeper, lowering pore pressures, you all have soil mechanics backgrounds. So that's essentially what's happening, right? And you have these dry years, you have wet years, and we talk about the epic bad landslide years, 1999, 2012, 2020. Those are in my career in this part of the world, those are bad landslide years. So, we know it's because of the water balance, just intuitively, and maybe we've monitored some of these slopes, but, really trying to, again, scale it up and understanding what that is and why that changes has been interesting. A lot of us take precip data, and you see a lot of reports and academic papers where we've taken all sorts of intensities and durations of precip and tried to correlate it to deep seated landslides. We're just not seeing the correlations, especially at scale. So it's something to do with that water balance, and it's trying to figure out how we actually characterize that water balance. So one of the data sets, again, working in satellite Earth observation the last 20 years, I've gleaned enough to know that you can derive soil moisture from satellite data. So we had a data science student, a civil engineering student from the University of Manitoba, join us summer 2021. And I said, I know there's satellite data out there that we can derive soil moisture from. Go find it for me. Because again, like there's a lot of data we use. There's local weather stations, there's weather radar, there's weather satellite, but it's how do we look continuously spatially over large regions at hydroclimate? And what we found is there's a data set called ERA5, produced by the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, ECMWF, where they've actually used soil data, ground points, like certain kind of golden spike sites, plus a variety of different types of satellite data collected back to 1950. And they have available a globally continuous data set from 1950 every hour for snowmelt, precipitation, ground for air temperature, and soil moisture over the entire globe. It's a data set that is not correct at any given point on the globe, but regionally it provides an indication of what's been happening. 2 years ago, we had to go and download pieces of this data onto BGC system. This is now served up in Google Earth Engine. So if you pull into Google Earth Engine, this is all accessible in the cloud. So even 2 years ago, we had a student that was going in and grabbing this data and pulling bits of it onto our computers so we can start doing analysis. So not only do we have the ERA5 data, and this is just shows you again the type of data you have. You can look spatially at different model depths of soil moisture. This is just some spring of 2021. But we also have precipitation data sets that, again, are models that go back to 2002 across all of North America between the CAP and the ANSEP data sets. We have the ERA5 back to 1950, but we also have a higher resolution soil moisture product that goes back to 2015 that's been produced by NASA. So I'm going to talk about the ERA 5, but there's other data sets out there that we can utilize. And again, this is something I didn't know about 2 years ago, and we've got some pretty good insights from these data. So what are the types of things we're learning from this data? So again, by having the displacement data pulled together and looking back, we're starting to look at the hydroclimatic data. So I'm gonna show you some things here. So the pointer doesn't work. SAAs, of course, displacement at different intervals in the subsurface. Purple is snow melt. Okay. Dark blue is 24-hour precipitation. Gray is 60-day cumulative precipitation. So when you look at the precipitation values of snow melt, and again, we'll show some longer term results, you don't see anything obvious. But when you start looking at the soil moisture, which is essentially that representation of that water balance between, what's evaporating, being pulled off, what's infiltrating, you start to see soil moisture trends that are correlating very well with the displacement. So we started looking at sites initially for clients, and they're saying, well, what sort of precipitation value should I worry about? And we started saying, well, let's look at the soil moisture where we're at, and where in the past, you've had additional precipitation on top of that base soil moisture and what that's done. One of the real ahas for us, like I mentioned, the bad landslide years in this part of the world. Again, worked with Dawn in '99 on Monroe. Again, 2013, any of you that were working know it in 2020. And we're seeing this consistently. So this is the north slope of the Athabasca River, which I've been working on for over 25 years in my different lives. Slope inclinometers going back to 1991. Big bad landslide year. This was a pretty bad landslide year. And then of course, everything fell apart in 2020. This is the 30-year soil moisture trend. Our bad landslide years are kicking off at our peak multi-year soil moisture trends. And we're getting wetting trends and drying trends. So seeing this, our pipeline operator clients are starting to say, okay, well, if I'm on a wetting trend, and historically I've had issues in the past, I know I should probably be paying attention. But if I'm on a multi-year drying trend, or I'm significantly dry abnormal, maybe I can act differently. So these are like, we've done a lot more that I'm not getting into today, but just our initial findings, like there's a lot to this soil moisture data that we had no idea and we never utilized before. The other thing you're able to do, because the data is there, is start looking more, statistically at the data and looking at deviations. So for those of you that, again, we're doing work in Washington State, we put this together for them because we're doing the same thing for the Washington State government right now. And we've done this for another site. So we said, okay, what we started doing is based on the 1950 to 70-year record of soil moisture, what are the deviations from mean? So if I'm here today, am I wet of mean or dry of mean? So what the blues are, so this is 0. This is sitting in the 70-year mean. This is 1.5 standard deviations. This is 2.5 above. So wet of mean, this is below. And you can really start looking at spatially the differences in regions. So it's not like the whole region is red, but where's red? And this was March 2014. So any of you that have heard of the Oso landslide in March 2014, it was a rapid collapse that buried part of the town of Oso. So you look at this and you say, okay, so March 2014, we were, let's say 1.5 standard deviations wet of mean. Okay, so we're wet of normal. So some of the other things we started to say, we talk about that water balance, right? So for how long has it been wet? Has it been wet, dry, or have you been multiple years of just, you had a crappy spring and, nothing warmed up and it got really red? Well, what we start to see here is, of course, we look at the precip and the snow melt. This is the timing of the collapse. We also started plotting temporally the deviations from mean. So mean, so where were we wet of mean over what different periods from 2000 to 2022? So we start to see that. And then we started looking at rolling 2-year averages. So over a 2-year period where we sustained wet. And what we see before OSO was that for the 5 years, for the 4 or 5 years prior to OSO, we were abnormally for that 2-year period wet of normal. And, following that and that decrease, there was likely then more of a sudden pulse, but that timing, has correlated very well with the collapse. And we've seen that on a few slides. So we're not even scratching the surface. The computers are going to be able to do more with this data than we can. This is what we're starting to absorb with our eyeballs, but this ability to utilize these big hydroclimatic data sets, I think to understand looking back, but as we move forward into prediction, I think are going to be a key part of our toolbox. So what's next? So for the work in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, we've pulled together a lot of displacement data. We've started looking at different sites at integration with hydroclimatic data to look at trends. The next thing is to start to zoning out the basin, the entire region, as to what are the geological controls, the broad controls, where do we have paleo valleys, where do we have incision, and then start to really, to break out the landslides and start to figure out where we have these common groupings of landslides where we can represent in a model. For any of you that have seen the work that my colleague Mike Porter's been doing, he's been using Markov chains to look at the probability of landslides transitioning to higher or lower states of activity. Most of that's above my head, but one of the things that we're working closely, because Mike and I do work closely together, is realizing that depending on the state of activity of the landslide, in terms of, dormant relic versus like being actively eroded, there's going to be a spectrum of landforms that should be more or less active. And we're trying to characterize all the landslides we have in our database in terms of typing. And then with that typing, we're starting to then gather all this displacement data. And for each of those landslide types, starting to look at, everything between no measurable displacements to, sudden displacements in between, and starting to assign activity levels based on the Crude and Barnes classification to these various. So we can start statistically looking at the distribution of the different types of landslides and activity. And with all of this, our first year of this project was data collection. The second year of the project was predominantly data architecture and making sure we got the data architecture right, and we got all the fields right for input into the data set. Because with this, we're building this for the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, but if we get the data architecture and the data collection process standardized, we can start porting this to different regions, which is our intent. So this is, frankly, the most critical part of this whole project beyond the cool types of data is the work we've done on the data side, and we finished most of that last year. Where we're at now is, again, we have the data, we have the database set, we're starting to characterize the landslide features. We've done proof of concept and figured out how to easily pipeline the ERA 5 data into our software, into our Azure environment. And we have a statistician, a data scientist, and a geoengineer working together right now, starting to look at the data and starting to look at trends and correlations. And we just had an update on that on Monday. So it's really exciting work, and probably by the end of this year, we think we'll be advanced significantly on the correlations and the models. And where we want to move then is to be able to integrate these hydroclimatic data coming in, coupled with those regional correlations, and then actually be able to provide raster-based alerts to our clients, is where we're aspirationally going with this work. So, we're starting to see what we can do. We're pulling together, as much data as we can now, to try to see what we can do. And Alberta is not the most data poor, but not the most data rich area. So, we're doing what we can do, but there's some things coming down the pipe over the next few years that are, I think, going to be a step change for all of us for how we're going to look at data. I've talked about a few satellites that are in orbit right now. Well, this just gives you an idea of the amount of satellites that are, and how they're, the launches of different satellites is increasing exponentially, and the amount of data that's being managed and relayed and put out there by the various space agencies. So, there's more and more satellites being launched to do different things, and even things that we're not using them for today that we don't know that are coming out. Cloud-based analytics, Google Earth Engine, Microsoft Planetary Computer. We have commercial arrangements with Google Earth Engine and are building that into our workflows. Like instead of you having to actually build your pipelines into big data or try to do that yourself, the environment's all there. The workbench is there. The algorithms are there. You can build the algorithms where you can actually build algorithms, pick them to the data, and spit out analytics back into your platform. So again, I work with data scientists. That's why I can talk about this. I don't know how to do it, but it's the things that they're showing me almost weekly that they're learning to do. We're mapping wildfire burn, within a week of things happening. We're mapping water change within a week, flooding. Like they're showing me all these applications we can do that they've just built applications for, or they already exist in Google Earth Engine. So same thing with the InSAR data. One of the really exciting things that's happening in InSAR, as I mentioned, is we talk about in this part of the world, although we have C-band, it's not great, but it's the L-band data that penetrates the vegetation that gets us really excited. Right now, you have to pay for it. Some clients pay for it. Some people can't afford it. But in 2024, January 29th, is the launch window for NISAR. This is the NASA Indian Space Research Organization SAR mission. I'm on the early adopters committee for this project. This will be a global coverage of L-band data, left-looking L-band data, covering the entire globe and freely available. European Space Agency will be launching a first of a constellation of L-band, the Roselle satellites in 2028. So in 5 years from now, all of a sudden, you're going to have multiple L-band satellites looking at two different directions at every piece of ground on the Earth, which gives you a lot of different options for looking not only one-dimensionally or two-dimensionally, but potentially three-dimensionally at displacements. The other big, really important thing is, again, I talk about having access to data scientists or remote sensing specialists. You're not going to have that in a few years. If you go on to the European Ground Motion Service website, right now, there is freely available processed LiDAR or InSAR over the entire European continent, except for Switzerland. And you can go and you can track at a pretty reasonable resolution. It's not finally, but you can track things that are moving. You can track regional, heave of volcanoes in Italy and subsidence in the Netherlands. This is a rock slope that I've been working on for 17 years in Norway, and although the detailed InSAR is way better, you can see the movements. You got about 10 pixels marking the movement of the Ultimus landslide. So this is freely available on the internet. Anybody can look at it. The exciting thing for us, potentially, is NASA's doing the same thing. NASA will be producing the North American displacement product. Currently, they are funded to cover all U.S. territories and 200 kilometers into Canada. A group of us is currently working with NRCan, the Canadian Space Agency, and Defence Research and Development Canada to see if they will fund to put in the pot. And I've talked to the NASA leads to actually get all the Canadian landmass covered. So we're hoping that in 2 years, we've got L-band data freely available without any other tools, just your browser that you can access for all your sites across Canada. That's not a given right now, but I have a lot of clients in the US, so they're pretty happy, but we're hoping we can get it here. And this is, they're going to have a C-band test product available November 2024, and then July 2025 is the plan to roll out a full year of L-band coverage over, again, at least all the US territories. But again, having that at your desktops, integrating that into your GIS or any of the spatial tools you use, that's our future. So just, summing up, our ability to characterize regional landslide processes is pretty good, but over the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be significantly better. Again, like these groups like Google and Microsoft are racing to provide service, and they're trying to be the platform of choice. So you're going to see more and more really cool tools that are really accessible to you. Again, these are things that as geoengineers, we typically don't learn about, but again, the teams I work with today are data scientists, climate scientists, Earth observation specialists. That's who I work with. I work with some geoengineers, but those are most of the people that I work with. But with this, as technology goes crazy and you get excited, your background and process understanding is what's required. It's great that a satellite will look down and see something, but if you don't understand why it's moving, what's driving it, what that actually means, it's also dangerous. So again, don't forget that when you start seeing all this cool data. And yeah, one of the things that I did mention here is, and I mentioned at the start on the early warning side is, a lot of our organizations are focused on climate resilience. Things are changing, right? And if we're actually going to build models that understand how things are going to change in the future, we have to understand how things have changed in the past and start using that data to project forward. So again, the work we're starting to build that I've talked about today is we're hoping that's going to provide the basis to some of that, for landslides, like to actually be able to predict change and how things need to be managed in the future. Not sure I did in time. I didn't even look, but yeah, again, thanks for your time. Again, I'm wearing two hats. This is all work that I do with BGC Engineering. I can be reached at either email, but again, happy to answer questions.
We do have time to take a few questions from the floor here and also online. So we'll open up to the floor.
No hockey game to go to. Come on.
You can be here all day. Online. You have all their questions.
Oh my goodness. Oh, Renato. Yeah, I was going to say you should have something. Yeah, no, please. With a beer after, but yeah, that's a good point because there's so many different views and so many different discussions you're having, right? So the question was, when you're working with clients, some are technologically early adopters, some are at different ends of the spectrum, some have different resources, different constraints. How do you communicate, the value of not only using technology, but convince them that support moving forward with forecasting? I think I kind of got it. But so, yeah, it's interesting. And I look at conversations I've had over the last week, like there's definitely industries, right? If I look at, for example, the pipeline sector in 2020 in Northern Alberta had a lot of near misses and significant damaging events, right? Their management and their regulators were telling them they had to figure something out and they had to find a way to proactively understand what might happen and be ready for it, right? So there's one group, and that's our early adopters. Like this majority of this work has been funded by pipeline clients, right? And they're typically the early adopters with using, we have pipeline clients that are every year flying hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of LiDAR and doing LiDAR detection every year. Clients that are coming to us before we even talk about it, bringing InSAR to us. Oh, we bought all this InSAR. Can you integrate it for us? So that's one end of the spectrum, right? I talked to, again, don't want to name and shame. So I talked to a Western Canadian government highways representative who said, I don't want to know what's happening next week because I don't have the resources to deal with it. I can't send people. If you tell me there's 5 different areas, I don't have people. So I don't want to know. But if you can tell me what's going to happen over the next 10, 20, 50 years, and I can work on the asset management side to see, should I continue patching this? Should I do a major repair? Should I move it? Should I close it? We want to know that, right? So they have different carrots. So I was down last week meeting with Washington Department of Natural Resources and Department of Transportation, Washington State. Don't know anything about this tech. Like we got brought in for this big project in Washington State because none of the consultants there and none of the, they don't use remote sensing to characterize landslide activity. So they brought us in and we designed a program for them, and they're very keen. But you know, they have their understanding is, again, they don't know what's happened over the last 20 years with these technologies. So so that's been an interesting conversation. But same thing, climate resilience. They want to know, they want to be able to predict, right? And when we can show them what's being done in some of these relationships, they're okay, I can get on board with that. So, you know, so the fact that we're starting to do this initial work is making the conversations change, but they all have different, like there's different drivers, right? Some of them it's internal management saying we don't want another big year like that year, we need loss. Some of them the regulators are driving. There's a new mega rule with the PHMSA, the pipeline regulator in the US, that you have to be able to predict an extreme event and respond, but they won't define what an extreme event is for landslides. So our operators are having to proactively, and we have a project in the Appalachia region, crowdsourced 10 pipeline operators in Appalachia that's just kicking off, where we're doing the same sort of work there. And because they want to get ahead of the regulator and bring them along and say, listen, you know, because there's like in any industry, there's leaders and laggards, right? The laggards are like, yeah, we can't do anything. There's no way we could predict that. That's preposterous. The leaders are saying, yeah, no, we think we can predict this and we want to get ahead of it. And we don't want you guys to bring us down, right? So we're seeing a lot of both. But anyways, just a bit of a cross section of the types of discussions I have around this, depending on who the asset owner. But we like you unfortunately declined our workshop last week. Myself, my colleague Chris Holm, and Mike Porter co-led a national workshop on landslide risk reduction last week. We had about 80 decision makers and scientists for landslide hazard management across Canada, from local Indigenous emergency support organizations to national regulators to everything in between. And you know, with all of them, again, common theme, like wishing we had known what was going to happen so we could respond, right? And that's the common, like we need to know what we think might happen, where it might happen, in order to either plan response, you know, mitigate. That's common, right? It's just they all have slightly different lenses. Oh, so the moisture data, how do we access the moisture data? So the models that are developed by ECMWF, they modeled soil moisture at depths of, like, you know, the upper 6 inches, the upper foot, the upper 2 feet, and then we take a model, it's a modeled value from 1 to 3 meters. That's estimated based on, again, soil type and air temperature and snow melt and precip, and it's trying to understand, again, like, you know, based on some ground calibration, what's the moisture. So all those absolute values, the volumetric soil moisture, is available in the data set on an hourly basis. So we're pulling that data right from those data sets. Well, again, we're using typically the modeled 1 to 3 meter value. Yeah. There's a
so with advancement in like artificial intelligence technology, what kind of procedures can be set in their future the technology involved in the preparation of regional landslide projects? And
I caught part of that. Sorry. No, I'm sorry, and I caught part of it. I was trying. Okay, let's because
one more time.
Okay, because I want to hear it here.
All right. With advancement in AI technology, what kind of cool features can we expect in near future if technology involved with characterization of regional landslide projects?
Yeah, no, so AI. So we're starting with machine learning. So we're starting with training models first, you know, so we're not letting the computers go for artificial intelligence. So first of all, it's based on our subject matter expertise, our knowledge expertise in the ground, the kinematics, and coupling them, trying to use machine learning models and train machine learning models to do this. And again, like ideally, as we start getting these global InSAR coverages and time series data, you could theoretically be continuing to feed the models and update the models and their predictive capabilities. Are we moving to full AI? Full AI, kind of says that the computers are just doing it all, which I think a lot of what we do is, based on geology and uncertainty. There needs to be a human involved. But again, I do see if we can start building the models and start getting these continuously fed displacement data sets coming from these freely available data, we do have the ability again to automatically start updating the models and feeding them and improving them in the background with not a lot of human intervention in certain cases. InSAR data looks at certain angles. If you got a landslide that's moving at this angle, you can't use it for that landslide. But again, so you need to be careful how, but yes, we should be able to do that in the next 5 years. Yeah.
Have you had any predictive models that have come true?
So we had any predictive models come true. So in 2021, so yes, in 2021, one of our initial funding companies said, listen, this is great. We're totally on board with the research, but I had a big failure last year. My management wants to know what's going to happen in 2021. So I need a precipitation threshold. This wasn't for Vincent. But so what we did is I looked at about 40 slopes in the region around where they were. I looked at previous movements, previous soil moisture levels, kind of said, well, which sort of and typically cumulative 60-day precipitation levels, where have we seen movement, where did we have major movements, and then looked at, and essentially we came up with enough of a confidence in saying, listen, if we get over 150 millimeter cumulative, 60-day cumulative, you should start maybe increasing your frequency of monitoring. So it's not run and wave, but you should start paying a little more attention. And if it hits like 225 millimeters based on this base soil moisture level this year, that you should probably, increase to weekly, get somebody out, have a look, pay attention to this slope, right? So we came up with these parameters, these thresholds. And then we actually got two things happen that summer of 2021. First of all, we got another site that we didn't have that we grabbed the historic data for. And we looked back and our thresholds would have perfectly caught the onset of these sites. So we were happy to see that, okay, the models we came up seemed to be applied regionally. And we did have one trigger that at the lower level that summer. And one of the nice things is, so we're using modeled data, modeled regional data, gridded data, like gridded precipitation data. They actually had a rain gauge on site. So they were able to determine that storm cell that should have triggered, that was triggering a precipitation, didn't hit their site, and they were able to stand down from their site. So, good news story. But the thresholds were, they were useful, and we're actually, we're hoping to move to, by next year at this time, have the models, the machine learning models, because it's not just, a precip value. It's water balance. It's a combination of how long has the slope been wet, how much are you adding to it, how much did it dry, like it's a mix. It's the rate of change. It's the absolute value of all these different things. So these are things that our brain, like I've shown things that our brains can process here. There's also a lot of combinations that we can't process. So in the machine learning, yeah, like there's a lot of different things that, we're hoping that all of those parameters get pulled in and that the data sets feeding those models and that all those parameters are being considered at sites. And that because, using just a single value threshold, even though that's what we're used to dealing with right now, and operationally it's comfortable, it's not what we want to use. Vincent.
What kind of things there both on the climate aspect in terms of and also from
yeah. So the Era 5 data, currently the Era 5, this data is a 30-kilometer pixel. The Era 5 land that we're starting to use is a 9-kilometer pixel. NISAR, the NASA product, so they're going to produce not only a displacement product, but they're going to produce a North American soil moisture product at 200-meter pixel. So again, like, what resolution is going to govern? There's uncertainty in geology. So, and that's what we're trying to figure out right now from a granularity point of view. So, so if we look at the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin as a whole, like I know practicing in it that landslides act way differently up there than down there. Okay, cool. Why? Right? Okay, well, some are incised into paleo valleys, some are incised into marine shales, some are surprised into bedrocks with bentonic zones. So first of all, we need to start parsing that out and seeing if we can, from a granularity point of view, if we can build representative regional correlations. And then, part of this landslide activity mapping we're doing is, and landform is trying to say, okay, within that class or grouping of landslides, do we have landslides with similar sort of morphology, between, again, relict, abandoned, and super active, that we can start breaking those out, and then can we apply thresholds differently to those different classes of landslides? So that's what we're trying to figure out, getting down to the grouping of landslide in a region is where we're aiming to get. But operation at a site, like, yeah, you have many sites, we work with you. For high risk sites, you're going to have on ground instrumentation. You're never going to use a regional warning system to take action at a high risk site. You're going to have strain gauges, you're going to have SIs, you're going to have different protocols in place, right? And that's what I talked about at the start, the difference between local and regional are complementary. Use local data to feed a regional model, and you use regional models to tell you when you need to do more at the local level. So you have to use them together.
So partially off, obviously, so do you have any clients in like northern authorities, northern Canada, that are looking at even related to like permafrost degradation and thawing and drift out?
We do, but we're not doing warning work for them right now. That'll be so right now we're looking at hydraulically driven landslides.
Yeah.
The next layer is like we're working on Washington State is looking at land use, vegetation change, right? So they want to see where can we build models that not only look at natural cycles, but human cycles imprinted on natural cycles. So that's one of the things we're doing there. Yes. The next thing are there sources of satellite data where we can look at ground temperature, air temperature change over time, where again, we could build a robust data set of displacement over time to start doing the same thing. So again, this is a big start. Like, yeah. Again, and we're doing this, we're rolling it out in a big portion of the Appalachian Mountains, big portion of Washington State, and the entire Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin right now. So we're just, again, the hydraulically driven side, we're trying to figure that first. It's again the data that's going to be hitting us. It's awesome. Yeah.
We will take one more from the floor if there is one, and then we'll deal with it online. Okay, well, let's give Corey another big hand.